Who's doing well, who's not? As we wrap up the year 2023, let's take stock of the state of the world's economy. Both the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank are predicting global economic growth for this year to stand at 3%. That's well below the historical average of 3.8% achieved during the year 2000 to 2019. The IMF said in an October report that the global economy is limping along, not sprinting. As for the coming year, expectations are modest, with both institutions forecasting the same rate at this year. As for China, its economy grew by 5.2% for the first 3 quarters of this year, but is facing complex and severe internal and external environment, to borrow the words from the spokesperson of China's National Bureau of Statistics. The IMF and World Bank predict China's growth to slow to around 4.5% next year. And how is all that impacting your life? Welcome to a special year-end edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from the Chinese capital by Wang Huiyao, founder and president of the think tank Center for China and Globalization, also vice chairman of the China Association for International Economic Cooperation under China's Ministry of Commerce. From Henderson, Nevada in the U.S. by William Li, chief economist and executive director at Milken Institute, and from Portland, Oregon in the U.S. by Professor Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. The warmest welcome to all of you and a happy holiday season. First of all, let's take a look at the state of the world economy. Earlier this month, I talked to Yukong Huang, who is a senior fellow of the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and who is also former chief representative of World Bank in China. Here's what he told me about his understanding of world economic performance for 2023.
We're part of an integrated world. Developed countries are responsible for a much larger share. Their prospects have been declining steadily over the past year. They've been hit by inflation in many countries. Europe has suffered a lot from the fact that the war in Ukraine has cut off energy supplies, raised commodities. Trade has become more difficult. Investment levels have stagnated. Japan has not been able to get out of its doldrums. The U.S. is doing better than the others, but even most market observers predict that the American economy is going to slow down, and inflation is still a big issue.
So, Mr. Wang, let me go to you first. Do you agree with his diagnosis of the world economy? And if so, what explains the sluggishness of the world's economy?
Thank you, Liu Xin. And I think what Yukong has described is largely correct, of course. And basically, we've been seeing 2023 and starting from 2022, of course, with this geopolitical war going on, and now we added the Middle East crisis to that. So the uncertainty and rivalry strategy of both U.S. and EU on China, that has a huge impact on the global economy, which I think also has dampened the business incentive to invest. But I think what we can see is that, of course, the whole world is slowing down. But the U.S., because of this geopolitical attention, a lot of hard money actually invested into the U.S. Stock market and its economy. So I think that U.S. dollar benefit from that. But I think on the other hand, China is still the center of the supply chain and production chain, and of course also value chain. We see things still moving after China lifted the COVID restriction. Things are quickly back to normal, and so with some overcoming difficulties. But I expect China would certainly reach its target of NPC set at the beginning of the 5%. But next year we see some stability of continue this momentum.
Mr. Li, if you were to use one word to describe the world economy, what would it be?
Sluggish and in the doldrums. And I think one of the reasons why it's sluggish and in the doldrums is because the world is trying to fight inflation. And the conventional theory says you get rid of inflation by reducing demand because demand exceeds supply. And so every economy in the West has been trying to reduce domestic demand in order to contain inflation. Unfortunately, inflation came about because in that COVID period, so much stimulus was pumped into the economy, especially in the United States, that people just wanted to buy a lot of stuff that wasn't available. So in that sense, I agree that the geopolitical tensions have added to the strains and caused people to worry about what to do in the future. But certainly the reason for the current sluggishness is because the global economies, the fiscal authorities, monetary authorities are trying to get rid of inflation, and the conventional wisdom is you get rid of inflation by reducing demand.
Professor Liang, your take on the pulse of the world economy. I mean, just now Mr. Li talked about inflation in the Western economies. However, in China, it's a different set of problems, and China's share of global growth is also much bigger than the Western shares combined.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to talk to you, Liu Xing. So I think for the world economy, yes, there has been high inflation, but I think that's largely due to supply side disruptions. That's due to COVID and other supply side shocks. For example, the slowdown in automobile production and semiconductor production, that has some impact on the supply side. And also, of course, the energy is due to war and so on. So I think the problem with fighting inflation was hiking interest rates. For the one, it's because the problem is that you're still seeing strong, labor market, you're still seeing strong real wage growth, and yet inflation has come down. So I think that largely says that, a lot of the supply side factors that attributed to inflation has now eased. But that said, I think, with the high interest rates now in the United States, the highest since 22 years, that will start to weigh on the economy. You start to see the mortgage rates. People are, used to be locked in at 4%. Now they're going to pay 7% for the 30-year mortgage rates. And then you're also seeing consumer credit is increasing, surpassing $1 trillion US dollars for the US households. So I think there are still a lot of headwinds for the US economy. And as for China, as you're totally right, the Chinese economy is very large in terms of size, and it has contributed to over 1/3 of the global growth in the past, decades. But I think, China's economy are also having challenges, especially, the weak demand and also some sectors' overcapacity, and also relatively subsumed expectations. So I think overall, this year, the economy has muddled through, but with a lot of divergences. But I think, the predictions for next year really also depends a lot on the, each country's policies and also the war, the two regional wars. So I think, we're not out of the woods.
Let's take a closer look at the share of different economies to the global growth that's predicted by the IMF. For instance, for the year 2023, China is projected to have contributed 35%. The Western Hemisphere as a whole is projected to have contributed 14%, while Europe about half of that, 7%. Mr. Wang, how do you look at that trajectory besides the overall health of the economy, but also the structure, it seems, of global economic growth is also shifting and tilting towards not just China, but also India, other developing and emerging economies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the global economy actually now is starting to realize that China is still a growth engine, to be exact. For example, China has launched so many global economy platforms. We had the Shanghai Import Expo, we had the Beijing Service Expo, we had also Hangzhou Digital Trade Expo, and we just recently had the Supply Chain Expo. So China is building all those world platforms for the global business.
This year, one of the focus has been the vitality of the Chinese economy. Since the beginning of this year, China's economy robustly rebounded because of the lifting of COVID restrictions. But later in the year, the second half and the third, especially the third quarter, people were kind of concerned whether that kind of rebound can be sustained. As early as in April 2023, I had an interview with Ambassador Fu Cong, head of Chinese mission to the EU. Let's take a look at what he said about the prospect of China's economic growth for 2023.
The Chinese economy is staging a robust rebound. This actually will mean a lot of economic opportunities for many countries, including European countries.
Mr. Lee, let me go to you. As the IMF concluded that China's economic growth for this year will be around 5.4%. That's against 3% last year. So what does that mean for China as the world's second largest economy?
Well, the IMF was rightly to take into account the fiscal policy measures that have been put in place in the post-COVID era for China that boosted China's growth rate in the third quarter. And I think they were quite right that there is going to be quite a boost, but it's all on the supply side. China has done a phenomenal job, actually, of being the supply side for the world, not just China. Its production is probably the most efficient in the world and has really done tremendous amounts of progress in trying to get to the frontier of where production is in almost all sectors. One of the problems that we in the West look at China and we worry about is whether there's sufficient demand within China to take up the excess supply that's being generated. And a lot of income uncertainty because certain foreign companies have stopped coming into China as rapidly as they have before. A lot of foreign capital has been diverted to other countries in Asia. And so looking forward, one of the things that Western investors are worried about is whether the Chinese domestic market will be able to grow as it has in the past. And that really is the source of dampening that we want to address for policymakers.
Professor Liang, in a major economic work meeting in mid-December 2023, it said that to further revive the economy, China still has to overcome some difficulties and challenges, including lack of effective demand, overcapacity in some sectors, lackluster social expectations, certain risks and hidden problems, bottlenecks in the domestic circulation, as well as rising complexity, severity, and uncertainty of the external environment. But the meeting also emphasized that overall favorable conditions outweigh unfavorable factors in China's development, and the fundamental trend of economic recovery and long-term positive outlook has not changed, urging stronger confidence. So what do these messages tell to you about the difficulties or the understanding of the difficulties China's economy is faced by China's leadership, and also what explains possibly the lack of confidence?
Yeah, I think this is a great summation of the long-term challenges of the Chinese economy. I think in the short term, the economy is still battling with the real estate sector adjustments and also, really the long-term scarring of the COVID. So I think the lack of confidence both comes from, the job prospect and also the income growth. As well as this real estate sort of readjustment, because 70% of the household's wealth is in the real estate sector. So when the real estate sector is not doing well, that would dampen the confidence of the consumers. But I think, again, I agree with Professor Huang that there are a lot of long-term advantages of the Chinese economy. It remains to be very innovative and dynamic. With right now, we're seeing a lot of industrial upgrading. A lot of the bank loans and credit is going to the industrial sector, not necessarily to generate more output, but really trying to get more value added. And also trying to automate the system to put in AI system to also increase the sort of technological components of the industrial outputs. So I think all these, and not to mention, the capital that is very abundant, bank loans, bank credits, and also a lot of private investors are investing. Outside of the real estate sector, we also have huge human capital, 12 million college graduates. To 2025, China is going to graduate 77,000 STEM students compared to 50,000 in the United States. So I think in the long term, when you look at labor or human capital, and also physical capital and finance capital, I think China are all on a really good, with a very good prospect. But in the short term, I do agree with this weak demand, which I think it's also good to look at the Central Economic Work Conference that talked about, we need to strengthen the demand. We need to try to boost the virtuous cycle between consumption and investment. So we need to have the high consumption growth to validate investment, but at the same time, we need to upgrade our investment. So I think that is really the right measure to push the economy forward.
Okay. Mr. Wang, how do you look at the emphasis on the lack of confidence and also the severity and complexity of the external economy, of the external environment for China's economic growth, do you think China may be able to sustain the 5%, more or less 5% growth for next year?
Well, I think it's quite possible. It's depends on also how we can really continue to give all the supply demand stimulus. And of course, China the economy. I mean, let's be frank. Has just recovered from a 3 years lockdown period, which is the largest lockdown of a 1.4 billion, which a lot of economic activity has been really slowed, and people need time to recover. For example, I was quite encouraged to see the tourism, particularly domestic tourism, recover. From the very beginning of this year, the airport was still not very busy, but now if you go to the airport, it's so crowded now. And also international tourism is picking up. But also, I think on the real estate side, that's another thing. I think China needs urbanization. China government still have lots of tools in its toolbox. For example, we have a household land of 300 million migrant workers. I mean, if that household land has been privatized or been allowed to transact, people from urban will go to buy, and people from 300 million migrant workers will sell their household land and put their down payment in the urban center to buy their apartments secondhand, and that will greatly stimulate the Chinese real estate market for another 10, 20 years boom. So I think China now needs more innovative policies. Like in the 80s, we have a contracting system. In the 90s, we have a urban housing reform. In the 20s, we joined the WTO. So, I mean, every decade we have a big revolutionary policy. I think now it's time for China to have some kind of policy like that for 300 million migrant workers, that after solving 800 million, extreme poverty lifting, we now need to solve the 300 million migrant workers to really, release their purchasing power and urbanization of the real happening. And that would be, I think, great policy to have.
Yeah. Well, while trying to lift people's living standards at home, China has been undertaking this huge initiative that's called the Belt and Road over the past decade. And I talked to Amr Moussa, former Secretary General of the League of Arab League, in early 2023 to get his take on China's prospect of cooperation with other developing countries or countries in the global south in terms of development. Let's listen in.
Relations are moving, and trade and cooperation are improving, progressing. I see a brighter future for relations, economic relations, and relations cooperation in so many fields between China and African countries, China and Arab countries. I here would underline the importance we in the Arab world has given to the major initiative led by China, bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together.
So geopolitical relations aside, on the economic side, Mr. Li, on the economic and trade front, how do you look at the importance of economic cooperation between China and other developing countries and emerging markets for 2023, and where is that going for 2024?
Well, China became the second largest economy in the world because, in part, of globalization. China became such an efficient producer that all the global supply chains focused in and sort of found themselves going through China. And I think globalization going forward is starting to reshape itself. People are realizing that they would like to diversify supply chains. There's more replicating of local supply chains that people want to have because of the difficulties that we encountered in COVID. So I think the globalization stage 2, China is doing its part in trying to reshape that by doing the Belt and Road strategy of focusing in on a network of countries that it can trade with, especially among the emerging market countries, where it can offer technology and infrastructure help, and at the same time develop these markets for China's own exports. So I think China is doing a very smart move in terms of adapting to how the global supply chains are reshaping themselves in the post-COVID era. So, and that will be very important in boosting China's own domestic economy, because as there are more jobs produced to service these new markets, the income security and the kind of wealth that's generated will help to secure the lack of demand that we currently see in the short run.
In terms of the benefits to this growth, Mr. Li, do you also see emerging economies in general benefiting from closer economic integration with China or interaction with China? For instance, the emerging economies for 2023 and 2024, as projected by the IMF, is expected to grow at 4%, whereas the advanced economy, only is looking at 1.5% or 1.4% for next year.
Well, we at the Milken Institute have always focused on where the young population and population growth centers are. And right now, if you look at Africa, it's got about 400 billion people, which rivals the size of China. And in China, we have an aging population, but in Africa, we have a young and growing population. So these are the new markets, and integrating into where the centers of growth will be the right strategy for China as well as the West. But China has really taken, I think, a lot of very strong steps to try to develop these emerging markets, and it'll be a very integral part of its future. I think one of the things that we have to remember, though, is that as we become more regionalized and we have spheres of influence in different parts of the world, it's important to also remember that the spheres of influence also have to trade among themselves. De-risking or disconnecting from the other growth centers in Europe and in the United States would be a serious mistake if you would just focus on the Asian growth center. And I think the policies going forward will have to set up a trade framework where we can take advantage of regional growth centers as well as inter-regional growth centers.
Absolutely. Well, I think on the Chinese policymakers' side, definitely they want to, trade with the world, basically. And actually, one of the very important aspects for the year 2023 has been the export of new energy cars from China. That number reached 1 million. It's an increase of over 80% year on year. Chinese investors are also building EV vehicles, meaning electric vehicles overseas. This past November, I visited such a workshop in California that's invested by the Chinese company BYD, and I talked to Stephen Gao, Senior Project Manager of BYD North America. Let's take a look.
The products we are building here are our green technology-based zero-emission buses.
Okay.
So, which is still a little bit of new technology for the market. So, we do have our training programs basically help all the new hires to get familiar with our product, get familiar with the production process, and being trained.
Professor Liang, how do you look at the future trend? China has been very heavy on new energy production and new energy vehicles and exporting in large volume, especially in the year 2023. What does that mean for the future and for the developed economies that are importing a huge chunk of this?
Right. I think developing green technologies is very important. It's sort of one stone hits two birds. One is about sustainable development, and the other one, of course, is about innovation and productivity growth. So I think it's very important for China to continue to leverage on the advantages that it has developed over, new energy vehicles, and that could go into not just passenger cars, but also electric buses or even electric boats and electric airplanes in the future. So I think China will continue to double down on this new energy and new technology, the green technology development, and I think that's very important. But going back to the question about the inhospitable global environment, I think on the one hand there is a subdued global demand due to inflation fighting interest rate hike that reduced demand around the world. But also, the U.S.'s strategies of, on the one hand, there is the continuous of, sort of diplomatic engagements, but on the other hand, is the de-risking, right? So the ban of high-tech exports to China, also the friendshoring and reshoring. So I think, the EU are also working on the anti-subsidy probe in China's new energy vehicles. So I think the global environment is not very conducive, so to speak, to these kinds of China's strategy of promoting sustainable growth or new energy to these advanced countries. But that said, I think developing countries are really still having the big markets for China, and China is also diversifying its own supply chain. Investing in Southeast Asia, investing in Mexico to circumvent some of these restrictions. So I think again, I think the advanced countries' strategies are really doing harm to their own economy, but also to the global transition to the more sustainable future.
Let's dig a little bit deeper as we are about to wrap up. And Mr. Wang, I'm going to go to you for this question. I talked to Dilma Rousseff, president of the New Development Bank, which is also what some people call the BRICS Bank, in late May, and she had this to say about the future of currency arrangement.
O que nós não achamos correto é que haja esse absoluto privilégio de fazer todas as negociações em dólar ou em euro. Podemos fazer nas moedas que sustentam, que são a base do comércio, do investimento nos nossos países.
So she was talking about the New Development Bank doesn't think that the absolute privilege of selling or doing all trade in US dollar, Europe is right. He said we need to use our own currencies. Of course, she's talking about the new emerging economies and especially the BRICS. Mr. Wang, what are we seeing in terms of the undercurrent, the shifting of the undercurrent in the global economic order? Are we seeing something profound in shaping?
Absolutely. I think we're probably seeing a new paradigm shift because the global south and BRICS countries, and particularly China, India, and all those global developing countries are really taking big shares in the global economy, and also these middle powers. We see Turkey, Indonesia, and Mexico, and all those countries are adding up, and so that really helps. You see, actually, BRICS has been doubled this time of this year, and there's another 20, 30 countries lined up because they don't want to pick sides. They want to really pick the economic benefit side of China, where China is the biggest economy in the BRICS countries, which is 5 times, 6 times larger than India economy. So that's where the benefit goes with the Belt and Road and with all those new alternative. Of course, you mentioned payment of the New Development Bank. That is also shaping. So that does actually, if they're pushed by the US-led Western world, I mean, the BRICS and China will have to find a new solution. So I think the bottom line is we still have to collaborate, but they have to really look at this new emerging strong global south on the stage of the world, and China is playing a key instrumental role in that process.
All right. Well, that was a wrap-up of the year 2003 in terms of economy and a glimpse into the future for 2024. Let's keep our eyes open to see what happens in that very important year. Many thanks to Wang Huiyao, William Li, and Professor Liang Yan joining us from different parts of the world for this special year-end edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching, and we'd like to wish you a great holiday season and a happy new year. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thank you for watching. You've got the point.